Hello, and welcome to this episode of Cyber Matters, part of the Kassouf Podcast Network. I'm your host, Russ Dorsey. I'm a principal and CIO at Kassouf & Company. And the Cyber Matters podcast is basically talking about the cyber and technology that matters to us and our clients, their businesses, their families, looking for those things that are important to know, for technology, not only to protect yourself, but also how technology is benefiting some of our clients, how they put it to use, but also talking to industry professionals and people that have been, in business and doing those things to serve this community. All right. Well, today we are very excited to have Darren Mott, retired special agent with the FBI, now working with. Am I allowed to mention your company? You want to mention?
Sure. Yeah, that's fine. Quantum Research.
Quantum Research up in Huntsville, but also the host of two podcasts, right?
Only one now. Yeah, I've
you consolidated them
one.
back. Okay. I came across Darren, I guess right before COVID when I was doing the more InfoGuard work, and I heard you speak a couple of times. Very exciting and engaging speaker, and he'll explain why. He's actually got more of a background in that. But then also 20 years with the FBI. After being a high school teacher, which I definitely want to get into, you decided to put in for the FBI, and you had two kids at the time, which your wife must have thought you were nuts, or maybe you.
She was all for it. She supported it. She was all for it.
It must have really been bad in high school if you decided to go in law enforcement, right? No.
Yeah. Well, we'll have that discussion. I'll tell you how we got there. That's the first question everybody always asks. I always get that question first.
Exactly. But of the interesting things you did with the FBI, because you had your career took you through counterintelligence. So what it says here in your bio is that you worked with the FSB, the Russians, on collaborative efforts in 2011, and then created the first national level program blending counterintelligence and cyber. And I think if there was a salad days in the FBI, and from what I've heard from other agents and listening to some of your podcasts, there really was. You got to invent things as you went along because the FBI was playing catch up big time for all those years, and I think you talk about that in your podcast. But I'm excited to have you here today. And at this point, with over 100 podcasts or more in the bag, you're seasoned at this. But you really started up during COVID. You've been going hard at it for 3.5, 4 years with this.
Right. Pre-COVID actually. I started. So I retired in 2019. Actually, I guess it was COVID when I did start the podcast. You're right. Yeah, thinking back now, 2020, I started the CyBUr Guy podcast in the summer of 2020. I'd kind of always wanted to do a podcast, but I'd retired, gone to work for Quantum Research, doing some cyber stuff for them. But it took me a while to make sure they were good with me doing a podcast. I don't talk. If you ever listen to my podcast, you really don't know where I work. I don't discuss it a whole lot because it's not really germane to the podcast. The point of my podcast is to help people understand in general terms what cyber means to them. And there's plenty of technical podcasts you can go listen to, and they'll tell you about the ones and zeros and, why people do whatever and how to program A, B, and C. Mine is more because I have an education background. So I have 2 master's degree, one in education, one in cybersecurity. I'm trying to blend those two. I've blended those two together to help people better understand what cyber means to them. If they're a small business owner, what does it mean as a small business owner? If you're an individual, what does it mean? How do you protect yourself from the array of cyber actors out there looking to steal information from businesses, individuals, and so on? So I try to distill it down into simplest format. So if you were to, in the last week, it's been the Move It file transfer app has been the big data breach unit for everybody. Congress got hit by it, or at least the U.S. government got hit by it. Several European companies have been hit by it. There's been 3 vulnerabilities in the software discovered in the last 2 weeks. But I talked about it in this week's podcast, but not from a technical perspective, just from what's it mean to you. So why, it's really it's that particular example just kind of shows you should patch your software and why you should patch your software. So it's more, I try to make it simplistic. Because there's plenty of technical ones out there. That was a long answer to your question, so apologies on that.
No, that's one reason it's enjoyable, and I won't say I've listened to hours and hours of it. I've probably caught 5 or 6 of the episodes. The thing that as you go through it is I like the mix of it because you do have the FBI stories, and so if you're listening to this podcast and you like true crime or any of those kinds of things, this is a good podcast to go listen to because some of the things that you guys talk about one of the first ones I caught was about the Invita or Invita.
Oh yeah, the Invita case. Yeah,
which was if you can imagine when the police have the raffle ticket for all the deadbeats, where they get them down to the police station to arrest them by giving them a free raffle. This was an invitation, the way I understand it, to a couple of Russian hackers who were posing as consultants to come over to the U.S. and perhaps do some consulting work, and the FBI grabs their credentials and arrest them before they go back, because you guys then turn around and go into their systems. And there was a lot to that, but then you listen to the one that I caught the other day prepping for this was the innocent images, and that was a fascinating hour, because just having to figure out how you go in, and this, again, go find this podcast, was one of the first agents to work on child pornography, and I'm sure that led to human trafficking and other things. But you say that's the one of the longest standing ongoing FBI.
Continues today.
Continues today.
So the Innocent Images program. My first boss in the FBI was the case agent for Innocent Images when it started in 1992-93 timeframe, and it was really the first big cyber case that the Bureau dealt with and it dealt with child pornography online, right? Obviously. I mean, there certainly had been other intrusion stuff. And this is not, so 92, remember the internet started in 88. First crime and first internet crime was the Morris worm. And so that really kind of started looking at, hey, there's problems we need to deal with here. And she'll tell the story about how it was they had done a search warrant at a guy's house for he was a child predator, and they found he was talking to all these guys online about child pornography, and that's what kind of led to it. She went and bought the first covert undercover computer in the FBI out of the Baltimore division, and started this undercover program that has continued as a national investigative methodology since then. Every field office has some version of Innocent Images that they still do today. It's kind of like it was the federal version of To Catch a Predator. If you ever watched the NBC To Catch a Predator series, this was the federal version of it, to catch the bad guys. So
yeah, and if I remember correctly, she was the first to go to get a Title III search warrant, because they go into AOL and realize that some of the chat rooms they can't get into, and there's no legal precedent yet. But you've got this, the wiretap Title III, if I understand that correctly. So there were things done there that have now become standard practice. But then also listening to the section about the psychology of it and the wear on the agents, emotionally and psychologically, having to deal with this. And the Bureau then had to adjust and say, well, this is how we're going to handle this material internally and keep everybody's mental health in check. I mean, it's a fascinating hour.
Yeah, the Invita case with the two Russians that they invited to Seattle, that was a multi-office investigation, because there were victims in other field offices that were that were targeted by this group. And one of my friends I worked with at FBI headquarters who talked about that case, she was the case agent she was on the case out of Los Angeles. Because of that case and her name being released through some of the public record documents, she is now forbidden from traveling to Russia. Not that she's looking to go, mind you, but if she ever goes to Russia, she can be arrested. And she's retired from the FBI as well now. So it's kind of, and that's one of the things I started the podcast to interview folks like that. And I did interview a bunch of them, but that well runs dry after a while. So it's kind of changed. It's morphed over. The podcast has morphed over time. I had a second one called the Get Cyber Smart podcast. It was only 7 to 10 minutes long, and it's kind of focused on one topic, but that never really got any traction for me. So I've kind of blended that particular aspect of that podcast into the CyBUr Guy. So there's the last 7 minutes of the CyBUr Guy podcast is the Get Cyber Smart portion. So I've kind of, it gives me less, it makes it easier to do it than trying to do 2 podcasts a week, which is, I thought I could do it every day, but certainly I cannot. I can do it. I'm lucky if I get it out once a week at this point now.
If there's only so many FBI agents that'll talk, of course you can get Scott Oggenbaum on to talk anytime, probably.
Yeah, but everybody's heard what he has to say. He says the same thing every time.
Yeah, and we want to make sure we mention him, because his book, what is that book, The Secret to Cybersecurity?
Yep.
Which he touts as these are the free things that you don't need to spend money on to protect your business, and pretty dead on. I mean, these things, again, we can't say these things enough, because as you talk about in your podcast, so many of these things are preventable. That's the tragic thing. And if you want to talk about that for a minute, why this podcast is, kind of pushing that, because that was one of the things you talk about, is that as an FBI agent, you figured out that most of everything that could have been done could have been prevented if people were educated, right?
Sure. If you look at the majority of cybercrime is it starts somehow with social engineering, be it intrusions into computer networks, be it what the new thing now is pig butchering, which is really just it's a variation on a romance scam. You have plenty of people who want to find love online, and they find love online, and it ends up costing them money. You have the lottery scams. It's not sophisticated. It's because bad guys are prying on people's goodness at the end of the day. You have, a lot of people who, like, if you're like me and spend all day dealing with cyber crime stuff, when I get these messages on LinkedIn saying, hey, I came across your profile, I'm really interested in what you do, can we talk? I will engage them for a while just for content so that I can then print what they told me, because that leads to pig butchering, because I want to go to WhatsApp or another encrypted service. Happens all the time. But I know what to look for, but there's plenty of people that don't. If you were just retired from your job, and so you're looking for another job, so you go on LinkedIn and you start getting messages from people who, and these are attractive ladies. Obviously, they're using somebody else's picture. And if you don't do your due diligence, suddenly you're in a rabbit hole, and it's hard to get out of. I remember once the worst story I heard as an FBI agent, and this was certainly not the worst ever, but it was bad for me, was a guy brought this lady in who was his neighbor and said, we need to file a complaint. She got an email saying she'd won the lottery online. This is in 2010. And she kept sending these people money, and before she told anybody, because she was embarrassed, she lost $200,000 to this lottery scam online. And then the sad thing, and this is what Scott will say this in his book as well, one of the truths of all of this is chances are you're not getting your money back, because once that money goes overseas, it's gone. I've had many people since I've retired reach out to me and say, hey, can you help me? This happened, blah, blah, blah. They got me for $50,000, and I'll dig into it a little bit. And, it happened 3 months ago. They can't figure out how to get the money back. The money is gone. It is not coming back, and chances are no one's going to jail. And so that's a hard pill for people to swallow. And it's a hard pill for me to give them to take, but a lot of times it is what it is.
There is a short window to get that back.
Yes.
If people are aware of that. And I think that's an important message to get out there, is if you do fall victim to this, and especially if it's a wire transfer of a large amount, you can get with the FBI and IC3, which we'll need to plug later, and they can do what's called I think call it a kill chain within 72 hours.
It's email compromise kill chain. That's what they call it. Yep.
So that's something to make sure that we get out to to people. But what amazed me was the stories and pig butchering. You keep mentioning that, so I'm going to throw it back over to you, because I've explained what that term is, but then explain kind of how those scams are working, because those, again, once they get them on the hook through technology, the rest of it's just a con game that they run, and then the money's gone.
Right. So the newest evolution of the romance scam is what's being called pig butchering, and the reason it comes from that term is there's a Chinese phrase, shanazapa or something like that. If I was smart, I would have had it pulled up here to look at. But it literally means pig butchering. And what they do is they pull you in as a typical romance scam, either through social media account, you start a conversation, and it goes for a long time. It's why it's called pig butchering, because what they do is they fatten the victim up before they take all their money. So essentially, they'll convince you, hey, I've got this great business opportunity. We can go into it together. Download this cryptocurrency market app. So you download this app or you go to a website that appears to be a cryptocurrency exchange site. And, cryptocurrency is, one of those magical cyber buzzwords that people don't want to be left behind. So they think it's a good idea. I'm not saying, plus or minus to cryptocurrency. I invested in previously, but I've cashed out of it all because it kind of all collapsed. But you go in, and you'll invest a certain amount, and they'll invest a certain amount. And there's a Ponzi scheme aspect to it, where you'll watch the value of your investments go up. You can pull a little bit out of it, and then you invest more and more and more and more and more. And then 6 months down the road, you've invested hundreds of thousands of dollars. It looks like you've made hundreds of thousands of dollars. And then you come in the next day, the money's all gone. The website disappeared. Your online paramour has disappeared, and you've basically been pig butchered at that particular point. I actually was doing a presentation several months ago at a community college for some educators And a guy came up after me, and I didn't call it pig butchering. I don't think I might have. I forget what I mentioned that particular scam, and he said, "Yeah, you mentioned that scam. I was a victim of it." Because I'm embarrassed to tell you how much I lost, but it was amazing how easy it was to get roped into it. And he had a whole text string of the conversations with the person. And he was asking me how, is it possible to get his money back? I said, when did it happen? He said, 2 or 3 months ago, and I had to say, nah, I'm sorry, that money is probably gone.
I listen to presentations from the Alabama Security Commission every year for different things that we do with InfraGard. But Joe Borg down there, who's and the scams that lay out and how quickly those do evolve. And again, just to warn, everybody that's listening to this is understanding I think the term is catfishing that goes on. We had we had a email come in here as spam, but it was somebody looking for tax services. But it was a pretty reasonable email. A couple of paragraphs. Hey, I'm coming to town. I'm looking for this service. Here's my story. My wife. It was, it's always in the details, as they say. My wife's been doing our accounting using TurboTax. I've got a small construction company. Named the city up in Ohio. Had his name. The email came from a legitimate website. You go to the website, it's a nice WordPress site that's built out, 30, 40 pages, pictures of homes, all this work that they've been done. The letter from the president on the front, there's the guy's name. You go look him up on Spokio. He's been living there for 20 years. Looks legitimate. When I go to social media, there's nothing there. I said, well, this is odd, because if this guy was doing this great work up there, there'd be a lot of raving fans, right? They'd be talking about him. And so I look up some text off of the website, and lo and behold, there's another website in Cleveland with the same information, the same site, but a picture of the truck, that's wrapped with the employees. And at that point, I go back and look, and the domain is about 2 weeks old. And that's when I realized that they'd actually stood up this site, or actually a bot had probably done it for them. They'd taken off all the identifiable stuff, put this guy's name. So I went to ChatGPT, and that's the punchline to all this. I said, hey, write me a letter. I'm this person. I've got this. I gave it the 4 details. It wrote almost the exact same email for me.
You know what you can do? You can take that email, put it in ChatGPT, and say, did you write this? It'll tell you if it did or not.
No, that's news. Okay, I didn't know that.
Okay. Because I did that for Scott. So Scott asked me to put together like an outline for something. So I very quickly went to ChatGPT and said, write an outline for this. I sent it to him, and he took it, put it in ChatGPT. He said, did you write this? And he sent me those screenshots. I said, yeah, I wrote that. ChatGPT said, yeah, that came from me or whatever. ChatGPT wrote this for you.
That's a good takeaway from this, because what we've always told people when we talk about phishing, but what we've always told in training was that English, especially Southern English, has always been a little bit of an armor for us, because if you're not from around here, you don't say the right words, right? Well, ChatGPT, that all goes away, right? You can say, write me an email from Alabama, and it's going to pattern after that. So we're seeing more and more of those things come, and with the APIs and everything, they're able to tie this in. Are you doing all right on time?
Yeah, I got about 15 minutes.
Okay. Well, just to kind of swing into business a little bit, because we were talking about business email compromise, which is far and above the most costly of the crimes that are out there. It outflanks cyber, cryptoware or ransomware. 30 to 1, 40 to 1. It's huge.
Yeah, ransomware 29 to 1. Now, I will say cryptocurrency and investment fraud has overtaken business email compromise.
It has.
For 2022. For 2022, It did, yeah.
Okay. Well, we need to follow up on that. Then I may see if I can get Joe Borg or somebody to come talk on from securities, Alabama Security. But on the other side of that, ransomware is still what everybody's afraid of. And as you point out, if you do get ransomed, there's probably an exfiltration component of that too, where they got your data first and they dropped the bomb on their way out, so they've got the data too. But understanding that it's the cloud as well. Microsoft, Office 365, which is supposed to be, it's probably the gold standard as far as security. Gmail, of course, they've had issues over there at Google recently. But what are companies needing to do that have gone to the cloud and they've got this, I'll say it's a false sense of security about it. I mean, what are you advising there? Because
I would say don't count on outsourcing your risk to your cloud provider. Sure, you're making some things easier for yourself by having everything in the cloud. But if you just say, hey, we're good, we put everything in the cloud, what do we have to worry about? We're golden. All right. Well, let's say you have 25% of your workforce works from home. In order for them to access the files they need, they have to go into the cloud. Well, the bad guy is able to send Susie from accounting an email, and she opens the spreadsheet that appeared to come from the CFO. The spreadsheet had malware, which gave an attacker access to her laptop, which now gives her access to all the bad guy access to all the cloud applications that you have now stored. How is that cloud really helping you? Versus, I mean, same problem. You'd have the same problem if you had an on-premises network. But do not think that just because you're moving stuff to the cloud that you are offloading your risk as well. You have to do all the same things. You have to make people aware of what not to click on. Be aware of all of the particular scam items. Be aware of, if they're working from home, particular risks there. Are you letting your kids download illegal movies on your work computer so they can watch Guardians of the Galaxy 3 before it comes out on Disney Plus? Because that could potentially have malware that impacts your machine and allows a bad actor access into your network, all those kind of things. So, I mean, I'm not saying cloud access is bad, but do your due diligence for who, don't use Floyd's cloud service for your data. I mean, if you're using Azure, or you're using AWS, or using Google's infrastructure, you're probably reasonably safe that your data is secure. But Office 365 was down last week for a couple hours. So people who were using that as their cloud service didn't have access to it for a while. So make sure you have multi-factor authentication turned on all of those things as well. We had a company that we were dealing with that they had multi-factor authentication for their on-premises stuff, but they didn't have it activated for their cloud access. So they got dinged there. They got the bad guys were able to use online cloud access to hijack a session for one of their users, and they got access to everything. They committed a business email compromise fraud in the middle of it. And it was simply because the company didn't turn on multi-factor authentication there as well. So even in your personal life and your business life, multi-factor authentication, long passwords is your main key to success.
Absolutely. And I think when you talk about something like Office 365 or G Suite, if you're on the business side, is understanding you've got to turn on all the switches. I mean, it's a secure platform, but the first thing when we went to 365 was, why do we need offshore access? So we turned through geofiltering. Basically, all of our accounts are shut off overseas. That's not to say somebody can't VPN in. I understand that, but so much of the other stuff that ties in there is not always tied to VPN on the back end. Like you say, if they're coming in through a web, an API or doing something there. Hours of operation, if you can restrict those things, there's device controls. We don't do Outlook web access because we had the conversation. Everybody's got phones, so we can pair the phone with MFA. Why do they need web access? And the answer was most of them don't. This group does. And then we were able to lock that down further. So those are the things. If you are, if you've moved to the cloud already and you're evaluating that, or if you think about going there, is understanding out of the box. It's up to you. And Microsoft's got a great set of tools, and so does G Suite. But you got to go in there, and it's not a do-it-yourself thing. You need somebody that's a cyber professional that can go through and go, okay, this is why you want to turn those things on, and use this system for somewhat less than it was designed to do. Because all of these other things are convenience. It's like the third-party plugins. We don't allow them. Some of them are very useful, and we've allowed, I think, one. But there's a place in Office 365 where you can turn that off. Say nobody can install third-party plugins into Outlook.
Yeah, and you need to really. I mean, even if you outsource your security. I'm using air quotes, to a cloud provider, you still need to do an overall risk assessment of your entire enterprise. I mean, not have to be NIST 800 171 compliant necessarily. Obviously, that's more government oriented, but still, you don't have to go to the 120 controls. But think about what are the top 10 things you need to know about your network to keep it safe? Are you patching regularly? Do you know your hardware? Do you know your software? Do you have multi-factor authentication? Are you using good good passwords? Are you training your folks? You can find 10 to 15 to do those well and export those to your cloud environment as well. So when you've got all your data in the cloud environment, come up with a cloud risk assessment as well and say, okay, what is our risk here within this environment? It may not be a whole lot, may be very limited, but still you should at least look at it. If you can't do that yourself, find someone who can do it for you. I mean, cybersecurity is a cost. You're gonna have to pay for it. Yeah. But not saying you have to go get CrowdStrike or Mandiant and pay $100,000 a year for their endpoint detection, but there's certainly investments you can make that can limit your exposure, because one data breach, and you're looking at $4.6 million on average for one data breach. So if you can absorb that, fine. If that's the risk you want to take, we can absorb that 4.6 million. But most small and medium-sized businesses I know can't afford that 4.6 million. And 60% of them are going to go out of business with one data breach. So,
yeah, that's a very good point to wrap on, is that, the move to the cloud. And again, I won't say we were reticent to do it, but we waited a long, long time. But I remember having the conversation with Microsoft a couple of years ago when they first came knocking on the door to come to their cloud. And I used to resell Office 365 back, in 2012, 2013, when you really took a lot of risk with it. But the guy from Microsoft said, we spend $1 billion a year on cybersecurity. And I said, man, how much do you think the Chinese are spending against that? I mean, seriously, Microsoft. You're also the biggest target, you and Google. So if you are a small business and the move to the cloud makes sense, the apps are better, the convenience is there, the mobility, especially now with the mobile workforce, is all there. Don't give up on. Don't throw away the idea that you still have to have, a CISO or somebody that's looking at this from a security perspective and helping you with your cloud, your cloud security, like you said. It is probably something that you can just ramp up and do in a period of time and say, hey, yeah, we've got that done, and then you just come back every year and revisit it, because once you get there, you're not changing things very often. But the home use computers is a whole nother podcast without a doubt. So,
well, one of the biggest vulnerability breaches, I guess, I don't know a better way to state it, in the last 6 months was Outlook's vulnerability. Mm-hmm. It was so bad that the government was going into companies and fixing it for them without their knowledge. That's how bad they realized it to be. So, I mean, yeah, great. Microsoft is a great company, does great, but they're doing $1 billion to secure themselves, but even that is not 100%.
Yeah. And then once you get that plan in place, if it's your cloud strategy or if you got to keep legacy on premise, get somebody that can come in and look. And again, you don't have to spend tens of thousands of dollars to do this right now, because so much of this is templated, but you do need somebody that understands the material and understands what those switches all mean in the cloud. Again, I always get anecdotal, but we're doing a risk assessment for a third party for us. And they said, if you got a Microsoft BA, we need to make sure you've executed one. I said, you don't execute a business associate agreement with Microsoft anymore. You used to, but now it's done for you, and it's their agreement, which is not even, and I'm talking about HIPAA here, but that's not, business associate agreements are supposed to be from us, the covered entity, and it's supposed to be our legal language that protects us. But Microsoft's so big, now you get to use theirs. Well, I guarantee you there's things in there that the lawyer would have a field day with if we were ever try to get damages out of Microsoft. They're going to be like, nope, you can't. We're held harmless from that. And all these other things that if it was our agreement, we would have never agreed to. But Microsoft doesn't even give you the option anymore. So you've got to read the service agreement and the standard terms and conditions. And by the way, there's your HIPAA BAA that we templated out for you, and good luck to you. And then it says,
and check your cyber insurance provider, make sure he's good with it too.
Which brings it down to the final part, which is make sure that once you've done all of this, is that your cyber insurance provider's got you covered. Because as we all say, it's not if, it's when, right? So, well, Darren, I want to thank you very much for your time, giving us this hour. As we wrap this, if you're looking for more information, like I said, Darren's got over 100 hours of material up on this. CyBUr Guy, CyBUr Guy, wherever you get your podcast. Look for the ones for family or for FBI. They're all very well labeled, and he's got links to a lot of content behind that too. But this has been a very informational and educational couple of segments, and thank you for tuning in with us too. So I'm your host, Russ Dorsey, with Cyber Matters here with Kassouf and the Kassouf Podcast Network, and wishing you a good afternoon, and we will see you again soon.